Welcome to the Mixology Talk Podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Julia, and we're the folks behind abarabove.com, the ultimate resource for craft bartenders, bar operators, and pretty much anybody who likes to drink tasty drinks.
So I'm a bar consultant with over 10 years of hospitality experience.
And I run the blog and the website, and I also run our sister company called Top Shelf Bar Supply. This is episode number 127, and this week we are talking seasonality. In a world where you can buy strawberries, watermelon, pears, peaches...
Pretty much everything
in the grocery store year-round, what's the point of a seasonal cocktail menu?
So as with anything, there's no absolute yes, absolute no answer to this question. So we're going to discuss some of the pros and cons of running a seasonal menu, what that means, and some considerations that you should have if you're kind of entertaining the idea of going on a seasonal route.
Or entertaining the idea of stopping.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get that. So, as with following some listener, reader requests, viewer requests,
consumer of our...
People keep asking us what we're drinking. And
yeah.
I think in the last episode we were drinking water, which is boring. But this week, it's actually kind of early. It's like 11 a.m., I think.
Yeah, it's pretty early.
We're going non-alcoholic. And actually, the timing was perfect because the folks at Cannonboro Sodas sent us these, and we thought that we would bust them out. So that's what we're drinking this time. I've got the honey basil.
Yeah, and I have the ginger beer.
You're so old school.
Ginger beer, I mean, it's like ketchup behind
it's true.
Most craft bars these days. But they sent us a couple different flavors.
Mm-hmm.
They had the honey basil. What was the ginger beer? I think there was a raspberry.
Oh yeah, raspberry mint.
Raspberry mint.
I don't remember the fourth one, but it was tasty.
Yeah, grapefruit.
Grapefruit.
Really good grapefruit. So yeah, they did a really good job.
So thanks, guys. Thanks for the sample.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers. So let's talk seasonality, shall we? So let's start with the best practices. I think it's generally understood that if you're in the nerdy craft cocktail community, that better is a seasonal cocktail menu. I don't know that we can necessarily make that assumption, but that's exactly what we're talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
So there's good and bad, pros and cons, as with anything. So I thought maybe we would sort of talk about this first, since it's kind of assumed to be the best case scenario.
Right.
So
absolutely.
what is like the good part of a seasonal cocktail menu? Kind of obvious, but...
Well, I think we can all agree that when fruit is in season, it just tastes better.
Yeah.
You have all these nuances that you don't get from the grocery store. A strawberry tastes very different when it's perfectly in season versus when you get it out of the grocery store, in the middle of December.
Are you suggesting that the fake thunderstorm spray heads do not accurately represent nature?
No, I don't know what you're talking about, actually.
Please tell me everybody has those. Man, if other people don't have those in their grocery stores, they're
going to think I'm crazy.
Crazy.
Okay, now I know what you're talking about.
Isn't that weird?
Yes.
But the point we're making is that, just the closer to the plant, the better it's going to taste.
Yeah.
In terms of time and geography.
Absolutely. And I think we can all agree on that. Something from your local farmer's market is just going to taste better than something that was shipped halfway across the country. It has picked early.
Picked a year ago.
Yeah, it could be. Like orange juice and stuff. They hold that stuff for a very long time. So it just tastes better.
I would agree with that. And then in addition, of course, I don't think this is something you can say across the board, but often in-season ingredients are cheaper. And that's a function of the fact that theoretically it hasn't traveled as far. You don't have to pay for that year-long storage and so on and so forth.
Right.
Now, this isn't always the case, especially if you would start looking at like local organic farms or, farm to bar, farm to shaker, that kind of stuff. You can sometimes pay a premium for that. So that's not always the case. But sometimes you can save money by buying local, fresh.
Yeah, and for like farmers markets, they tend to be a little bit more expensive because they have to pay for the booths and the travel time and all this other stuff. But a little hack for you, if you go towards the end of the farmers market, they don't want to take the stuff home with them, so you can negotiate a really good price on cases of stuff.
And the other thing is, of course, if you're buying for a bar and you're planning on turning those strawberries into a puree, you probably don't care that they're really beautiful.
Right,
so
absolutely.
You can take the ugly produce to some extent and perhaps save some money there too.
Yeah. So it's cheaper.
Can be.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
Better flavor.
Yes, better flavor. In addition, it works well with a seasonal food menu. If you have a seasonal food menu and you don't have a seasonal cocktail menu, I think that could be kind of weird.
Yeah, there could be a little bit of, it doesn't quite blend into a cohesive food and cocktail program. So your kitchen or your bar should mirror your kitchen. They should be really, really hand in hand.
Just should be consistent experience for the customer.
Absolutely.
Which makes sense. And similarly, in terms of the experience of the customer, I mean, your customer, depending what kind of bar you are, if you're a neighborhood bar, your customers are going to have one expectation. If you're like a really high-end cocktail bar charging $18 for a cocktail, your customers are going to have another expectation about whether or not you offer a seasonal cocktail menu.
Right.
So it's going to be a consideration. I think that you may not have an option in some markets and at some price points. So I don't know if that's a pro.
Yeah, well, I think on the price point conversation, if somebody spends $13, $14 on a cocktail and they're not getting seasonal ingredients, that could be a negative too.
That's true. If they see you pouring sweet and sour mix, they might be a little bit bummed.
Right, and I know market to market is very different, but in general, price is a reflection of quality.
And effort.
Theoretically.
I mean, in theory, that $18, $14 cocktail is going to take more effort. There's a reason you're charging it.
Right.
Maybe it's just rent. I don't know.
Yeah.
If you're in San Francisco, then I think all bets are off. But
right.
So let's talk about downsides. There's definitely some downsides to a seasonal cocktail menu. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and I think this is like several of our bullet points, is laziness. Like, I don't think you can be lazy and pull off a seasonal cocktail menu. I just don't think that that's on the cards. Like, it's not going to work.
Yeah, you're going to be dedicating a lot of your labor hours into production. This is something I've talked with a lot of people about. It seems like those hours tend to fall on the beverage manager because they're hourly, so it kind of gets absorbed into their salary, for good or bad. But if you don't want to pull 60-hour weeks doing production and all this stuff, you have to pay somebody to do that.
And if you're doing this, you're not doing something else.
Right, exactly.
So the thing you would have been doing, I don't know, writing schedules or things like that.
Building relationships, all these things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the time commitment, I think, is huge. And yes, there's the sort of prep side of things. Like, we got a case of strawberries, we need to turn it into syrup or
infusion or whatever.
There's that sort of mixology prep side of things, but there's also, I think, the staff training side of things. Every time you change a menu, you got to train your staff. There's the I don't know, you got to open up the program on your computer and type up the new menu.
Yeah, you have to roll it out and make sure all the old menus come out, the new ones come in, and there's no crossover
Fight
there.
The printer, take it in the backyard.
Oh, I'm getting nervous just talking about that. But it's so true. There's so many intricacies when you start to do this kind of menu that if you lose a step, it can start to snowball. Yeah. And when we're all kind of on the same subject matter, training somebody. So if you're not going to do the production yourself, with a variability of flavor and taste, and a peach in the beginning of the season versus the end of the season, they're going to taste very different. Yeah. So you have to kind of either tweak your recipes in the back of house so that way they're all consistent before they ever hit your bartenders, or the bartenders have to be skilled enough to know that the flavor is going to be off. They have to adjust it. They have to either add more simple syrup or more acid, and still come out with the same cocktail they had 4 weeks ago.
In my opinion, this is the biggest downside. I mean, I remember you used to rant about, this week's pineapples and last week's pineapples are completely different.
Oh.
Or you were telling me a story about a vendor who would just, give you different varietals of grapefruit even if you asked for the same one.
It was actually even worse. It was juice, so you had no choice. No. So sometimes you have this really sweet, like a ruby red juice that comes in when you order grapefruit juice. Sometimes you get this really yellow, almost lemon juice,
which completely changes
which
the
is
flavor.
so different if you're doing greyhounds or palomas or anything like that. It just throws the entire flavor profile, and you can't really pull it back.
Right.
You can't resurrect it because it's so far in the other area. The color's different, the flavors are different.
You can make it more red by throwing Campari in, but that's going to taste different.
Right, exactly. So now you're kind of wrestling with all these things, and unless you have it all set up and you have all your relationships built with the vendors, and you know that you only accept this one specific variety of grapefruit juice, then it can be a big hurdle, especially on your days off.
Well, that's true. And even if the vendors are on board and you're getting the same varietal week over week over week, I mean, maybe 1 week is way hotter than the next, and you're going to see a difference in the sweetness of your pineapples. I mean, it's nature, right? I mean, I think we love to sort of like harness nature and turn it into something delicious. But the fact of the matter is like nature's going to win. And that's where that skill comes in. Right. I think you have a choice. You can either take your weekly box of strawberries. I'm just going to use strawberries because it's easy. And, you know, like you said, pre-prep it. Turn it into a puree, turn it into a syrup, and you or somebody skilled on your staff who has the skills to do this, taste it versus last week's puree and calibrate so that the puree always tastes exactly the same. You do that, great, your front of house bartenders don't need to do any calibration, no problem. Now, if you don't do that, then you're going to need to trust your front of house bartenders that they're going to have to taste.
Right.
They're going to have to taste every cocktail, or at least every
the
week.
First batch.
Yeah, exactly. And you're going to trust that they get it right. And if you want that consistent customer experience, it's not going to be a consistent back of house, front of house. I mean, it's different for the person producing the cocktail. And this is, I think, a huge ramification for the staff, and I think a huge headache.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, once you start going down the road of seasonal cocktails, like we've already talked about, there's so many layers to this that it can be just kind of a nightmare. But at the end of the day, in my opinion, it produces a much better cocktail. The customer experience, what they get in the glass is so much better, personally, than something going off the shelf.
I don't want to get too far down on the negatives. It's more work, but I mean, usually the better things are.
Right, exactly.
So I think that there's definitely that. I mean, another thing to think about, I think, we live in California. We're so fortunate. We live in the San Francisco Bay Area. We've got the entire Central Valley of California. We've got citrus. We've got, I guess avocados aren't really a cocktail ingredient.
No, it can be. Yeah, I've seen it in there.
We've got fruit. We've got everything. We're so fortunate that if I want to like waltz on down to my, local source grocery store, I can grab what's seasonal and it's no big deal and it's going to be delicious.
Right.
If I lived in Anchorage...
In January, or at all, frankly. Right. I
mean, you're probably not going to find a lot of super local stuff.
Yeah, you probably don't want to tap into that watermelon in January.
I think I don't want to overlook this because I know we've got listeners all over the world, and I don't think you can't pretend that we all live within 50 miles of a really great farm.
Right.
And so you may not have a choice. You may not be in a position where you can have any fruit whatsoever on the menu in January if you want to stay local. And that's going to be a consideration because, I mean, not having any fruit at all. I remember we were speaking with somebody who wanted to have an upper New York State
I remember this.
Cocktail menu, or at least a cocktail. And he
wanted to source everything in 50 miles, right?
Yeah, it was a really, really local source cocktail menu, and he was really struggling because they don't grow citrus.
Yeah.
And so he was asking us, like, what can I do for citrus? And there weren't that many options.
Right, especially with that small geographic boundary to operate in. It's just super hard.
So sometimes you're going to have to go for stuff that's sourced further away. So I don't want to pretend that we all live in this, like, hunky-dory world of, like, organic, local, seasonal produce that's always available. That would be wonderful, but you can come visit. We'll show you our grocery store. We're kind of spoiled.
Yeah.
And the last thing, again, not a bad thing, but a consideration, is the fact that if you're going to stay seasonal, you're going to be updating your menu a lot.
Yeah.
You can't just update it when you feel like it. You have to kind of follow the fruit. And that can be quite frequently, right?
That could take, and just understanding what's coming down the pipeline and understanding, okay, this varietal comes to market 2 weeks before the next varietal, and then how you kind of chain those together can take a lifetime to really master and to understand what's coming, down, weeks in advance, so you can prep your menu instead of being, you have to put a lot more forethought into it versus being reactionary.
Well, I think you have to know, like, what was it like last year?
Right.
Okay, if the strawberries taste like this now, we're probably looking at peak season in 2 weeks. So what that's going to mean is probably a little bit more sweetness, a little more fruit flavor. I'm gonna build the recipe with that in mind, on the assumption that as we get closer to peak season, obviously the back of house person's going to be calibrating. Right. But you just got to know what's coming. And you were saying during the height of the season, you might be updating every 2 months.
Every 2 weeks.
That is a huge amount of effort. It's the mixology. It's the, like, okay, out with the mangoes, in with the pears. Like, what are we going to make with pears this year? What are we going to, and maybe if you've done it for a few years, you can leverage past year's recipes. But if you haven't, you're looking at a full-time job right there.
Yeah, it really is very time consuming, and just the collaboration with you, the chef, the vendors, the pastry chef, anybody that's going
Your
in through the neighborhood bar that you go to. That's what you meant, right?
Right.
It can be a lot of work, but it's so satisfying. Once you start to get your hands on this stuff, you understand how to get the best flavor out of a particular piece of fruit or vegetable or an herb. That's a skill set that can really move you forward in this career.
That's very true.
So for me, it was really worth investing into understanding these concepts and really knowing the best way to get flavor.
Yeah.
I think many other people have started companies based off of this because of their experiences.
Yeah. No, definitely. And so, I don't want to come across as being like negative Nancy. I just tend to be more of like a logistics person. You probably know that about me. You've been listening for a while. But there are some options. Again, if you live in Anchorage, you're not you can still have a bar.
Mm-hmm.
There are a couple options. The obvious one is not use as much fruit, or stick with more less seasonally dependent recipes. For example, a margarita.
Well, a lot of the classic cocktails don't depend on seasonal produce. So if you have a couple of staples on your menu that you always have on there, or you kind of start to move some classics in and out of your menu. Depending on your seasonal, focus on the menu, like Negronis in the winter or Manhattans in the winter, and then a margarita in the spring and summer, something like that.
You can still you can still follow sort of the seasonal flavors without necessarily having a farm next door.
And this might be the answer for you, really focus on styles of seasonally based cocktails versus
spices in the winter.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Instead of actually okay, I'm going to do strawberries, or I'm going to do these amazing peaches from Frog's Hollow, and then dedicate.
Did you make that up, or is that a real farm?
No, it's a real farm. They're highly coveted for their peaches.
Name.
I think it's Frog's Hollow. I'm pretty sure it is.
Sounds very Northern California hipster.
Right. So it just can be a lot to get into. Yeah. So.
But there are other options.
There are.
I think that's a really good point. The next option is there's a lot of vendors out there. We mentioned it earlier as almost a downside, but it doesn't have to be. There are some vendors out there, and what they do is they get fruit at the peak of its season, and they either turn it into a puree or they turn it into frozen fruit.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what does that mean? It means that it's frozen. It's going to be fairly consistent in flavor year-round, and it's actually transportable.
Right.
So you could go the puree route. I know there's companies like the Perfect Puree of Napa Valley. Their big thing is consistency. I don't know exactly what their supply chain looks like, but I know that their big thing is consistency. I know that you were talking about, I think it was David Arnold, right? Mm-hmm. Who was saying...
Yeah, I was in a seminar, and we were talking about seasonal cocktails and kind of the focus on flavor and all that. And he said, yeah, it's great if you can operate like that, but here's a little hack if you want to put something on the menu that is a little out of season, like strawberries, for example. He says, in the middle of winter, get frozen stuff. Because usually what happens is there's so much produce being produced, so much strawberries being produced in such a limited time that there's a glut. And so what they do is they freeze them. Mm-hmm. So what you get from a frozen fruit is actually frozen at the height of its season. Now, it's not going to work for garnish because it's going to fall apart and it looks frozen.
Not so much.
Yeah, right, exactly. But if you want that flavor, he said that is a really, really good alternative with the sugar and the acid level of the fruit. And it's fairly, you can see that it could be fairly consistent. You probably still have to tweak it a little bit on the back end, but it's a much better option than getting white strawberries in December.
Right. Yeah. I think it's counterintuitive because we as an industry, we're all about fresh. But again, a lot of us are lucky to live in California and we can say that sort of thing.
Right. And if you have this one rockstar cocktail that just cranks out all the time and it has strawberry in it, or we're just using this as an example, but it could be any fruit or herb or anything like that.
Mango.
But if you take it away, you're going to be hurting your sales. So what do you do? Mm-hmm. So now you find some other options. And this could be a really good place to look at.
I think that's a really good point, and it also helps solve that consistency problem as well. So you do have options, which still sort of preserve the guest experience and give that amazing experience, but may not necessarily be like farm to table. Yeah,
and one other thing to look into. We covered a bunch of this in the Bartender to Entrepreneur series. But there's a lot of mixologists that have gone this route and are producing really beautiful syrups for cocktails.
That's very true.
So Small Hands Food. I know Max Messier in New Orleans is doing some fantastic stuff. I can't remember the name of his company, but
we'll
he's got
put it
some
in the show notes.
Beautiful syrups that he makes seasonally. He does batches in a season, and it hopefully will last him the entire year.
So once again, you batch it when it's in season.
You're capturing it,
yeah,
right? Exactly.
And they take care of the preservation step for you, and frankly, the pre-prep as well.
Yeah, and so you're paying for
a service, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
A product that is kind of taking off some of your
that you don't have to pay for in labor. I mean, it kind of makes sense a lot of the time.
Yeah, it definitely can. So so what's the verdict? There is none. I mean, spoiler alert, there's never going to be one. It depends, right? I mean, if you're going for a James Beard Award, you're probably not going to want to like bust out a Costco bag of frozen strawberries.
Yeah.
At least maybe do it in like the back of house.
Well, and I mean, if you're going for that, they're going to know what's in season and what isn't.
Right.
So if anything's kind of off that, then they're gonna be able to identify that kind of stuff. But if you're a super seasonal restaurant or bar, then you know what you're in for. You've invested in training. You understand, how to do all these processes, and you move forward. If you're a local bar in your neighborhood, maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe people don't care.
And maybe people aren't willing to pay the prices that you would have to pay to be able to justify all that prep time and all the extra staffing sort of ramifications.
Right.
I mean, if folks just want a $9 cocktail, then at least in San Francisco, you're going to be limited on how much you can do with that.
Right, exactly. So shot in a beer bar, probably not.
Not so much.
A high-end mixology place, most likely you're probably going to be investing in training and education and why this is so important for your cocktail program. So it's kind of a large spectrum, basically.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many different kinds of bar. If you're in a nightclub, maybe not. Probably going to want to prep stuff pretty quickly. But so it's not just who you already are, but how you want to be seen in the marketplace and what your customers demand based on how they perceive you and how you want to be perceived. Again, we talked about price point. We talked about staffing and time considerations. I mean, I think that's... You can certainly train up your staff for these sorts of skills, but there's some things that just take years. I would say the mixology skills in terms of being able to calibrate flavor, calibrate your sweetness and your acid. That's something that takes a large amount of practice.
Yeah.
Being able to create cocktails quickly enough that you can actually keep up with that cadence. If you're creating new cocktails every 2 months in the summer, every 2 weeks in the summer, you better make them quick.
Yeah.
You don't have time to sort of go back and forth with the kitchen 14 times.
Yeah.
And then the other thing you mentioned, which I think is a really good point, is knowing what's in season when and being able to kind of predict the future in terms of what it's going to taste like next week, what's going to show up on the catalog next week, that kind of stuff. It'll let you sort of plan ahead instead of always sort of falling behind.
Yeah, and it's all what you want to put into it, right? If you see this as a long-term career, if you want to start to develop these skill sets, that could be a whole nother reason.
Oh, absolutely.
And if you're able to talk to your manager or the owner and say, look, this is why we want to do it. It's a better guest experience. We can charge more money. It's a reflection of our culinary program. Then you get to start to learn all these new tricks and start to talk to chefs about flavor extraction and flavor compatibility and kind of go down this rabbit hole of mixology, which is something I absolutely love and many other people do.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because I feel like this episode feels a little bit like we're against
anti-seasonal,
right?
Yeah,
and I think that there's like a big elephant in the room, and that is that like it's awesome.
I love it.
A seasonal cocktail menu
a bar without it.
Yeah, not only is it like an incredible guest experience, I mean, the fact of the matter is like this sort of like seasonality has like completely changed the bar industry for the better. I mean, it may not be for everybody, but it's completely changed the consumer's perception of cocktails.
Right.
Not only that, but like, I mean, you would come home from work on days where like you would stay a few hours after and just like nerd out in the kitchen.
Oh yeah.
Just the happiness that comes from that
it
creativity,
is. It's pretty cool.
Like, forget logistics. Sometimes you just want to do what you love, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, and I think that's something that many people in our industry love about this what we do is this artistic expression of our creative minds when it comes to pulling a flavor out and putting it into a cocktail and actually make it tasty. I mean, that is very gratifying.
You hand it to a customer and they go, holy cow, this
I've
is
never
amazing.
had this before. And you probably will never have it anywhere else except for this one bar. So
especially because it's going out of season.
Right. Well, and I mean, one of the things that we did at the last bar I worked at, not on the beverage side, but on the dessert side, there were certain dishes that were just celebrated. They were anxiously awaited every single year for the release. And if you do that on the cocktail side, you can build up a really big fan following and have a launch party and all this stuff and make it an event, to kind of celebrate this passage of seasons and stuff like that. It could be really, really cool if you do it correctly. Yeah. People would come in literally just for this dessert.
Yeah. Do you have the peach mojito yet, guys?
Right, exactly. Yeah. Or, the peach smash or whatever.
Yeah. I remember that dessert.
It's
I was
legendary.
one of those. I would literally ask him, like, "Hey."
And when you cut it off, people cried.
It was sad.
It was so sad. Like even the staff members, because we could sell it all day long without. Yeah. I mean, and it was not cheap. It was probably a $15 dessert if I remember correctly.
I think so.
But it was
worth it.
It was worth it, and people would come in just for this one thing. It was crazy. So I hope today's discussion has helped shed some light on some of the pros and cons of running a seasonal menu. I know we kind of focused a little bit on negative, but there is a lot of positives as well. So, we won't rehash that. But if you want any of the notes, please head on over to the show notes at mixologytalk.com/127.
127. When did that happen?
I know, holy cow.
And another thing, I just thought this might be worth mentioning today. We don't talk about this very often, but we actually created a mixology certification. This is like the nerdy stuff. This is like the making amazing cocktails that your guest loves kind of
from
thing.
scratch, or taking an idea and then implementing it all the way through.
It's not bartending. And if you're interested, we do have a coupon code for listeners of the podcast. I think it's just Mixology Talk. So to learn more about the program, it's mixologytalk.com/certification. And the coupon code you're looking for is Mixology Talk. We'll put the link in the show notes too. But basically, this is just a really, really in-depth, thorough online video course that gives you access to a Facebook group and a whole bunch of other people who nerd out on this stuff.
Definitely covered a lot of what we talked about today with seasonal ingredients.
Absolutely. So if you're into this sort of thing, definitely take a look. You might enjoy it, and we would love to see you there.
Never miss an episode by subscribing in iTunes or YouTube. And as always, check out the show notes by clicking on the right.